Today, we step into Paris of 1872, a city stitched with scars, where the smoke of revolt still clings to stone and silence hangs heavier than perfume. In the narrow spine of Rue des Martyrs, history left behind not a monument, but a diary. Its pages spoke of knocks beneath the floorboards, shadows with stolen voices, and a woman who would not stay buried. No crime was ever reported. No body was ever found. Yet the words bled on, until even the handwriting confessed it was no longer human. The police ignored it. Collectors whispered about it, and the legend refused to die. They call it the Rue des Martyrs Diary, Paris's most unsettling ghost written not on walls, but in ink that refuses to fade. The first line of the diary was written in a hand that shook, as though the ink itself was afraid to commit to paper. They are already in the walls. I can hear them, whisper my name with mouths that do not belong to the living. Paris, 1872. The city was still trying to stitch itself back together after the Franco-Prussian War, after the bloodletting of the Paris Commune. And yet, among the soot and the grief, someone sat in a narrow apartment on Rue des Martyrs, scribbling horrors into a leather-bound journal. The handwriting is frantic. Sentences veer off mid-thought, like the author lost courage or breath. In the margins, cryptic drawings, half-human faces, bodies dissolving into shadow. On the 14th page, a chilling sentence. I buried her beneath the floorboards, but she still knocks. No police report was filed. No missing person matched the claim. No one even knew who she was. The diary surfaced decades later in a bookstall, its binding cracked, its pages smelling faintly of rot. What unnerved collectors wasn't just the text, but the stains, brown, flaky, clotted in the corners. Blood, according to some. Rust, according to others. And yet the most terrifying part wasn't the gore or the confession. It was how the diary ended. The final page reads only, "This is not my handwriting. This is not my voice. If you find this, burn it, or we'll learn you, too." The ink shifts halfway down the page, as though another hand seized the pen. What do you do when history coughs up a book that seems alive? When paper itself trembles with madness? Who wrote it? Who died for it? And why did Paris swallow the whole affair like it never happened? The Rue des Martyrs Diary, an object of whispered legend, an unsolved scream pressed between leather covers. Paris in 1872 was not the glittering postcard of the Belle Epoque yet. It was bruised, limping, half-starved from humiliation. The Franco-Prussian War had carved its initials into the bones of the city, and the commune that followed left blood in the gutters and smoke curling into the sky. Imagine living in a city that executed its own citizens in the streets, where churches doubled as prisons, and the stench of burnt gunpowder lingered longer than perfume. That was Paris. The ghost of revolution staggering down cobblestones slicked with rain and memory. The Rue des Martyrs, stretching north from the heart of the city up toward Montmartre, was both artery and wound. By day, the street teemed with shopkeepers hawking bread that barely satisfied ration tickets, seamstresses bent over dimly lit windows, and boys carrying crates for tips that could buy only crumbs. By night, however, it transformed into something else. A place of drink, whispers, and shadows. A street where sin and survival were neighbors and nobody ever really slept. It was in this environment, a Paris trembling between ruin and rebirth, that the diary appeared. The very name of the street felt prophetic. Rue des Martyrs, a street of martyrs, of sacrifices. Centuries earlier, Saint Denis himself was said to have walked this path carrying his severed head. Now, in 1872, the ghosts were fresher. A city haunted by war, executions, betrayals. Was it any wonder that someone, in some shabby apartment above a bakery or wine shop, began scribbling down the demons that refused to leave them alone? Psychologically, the city was ripe for hysteria. Trauma doesn't vanish with treaties. It festers. Citizens carried their grief like hidden daggers, and paranoia seeped into every corner. You didn't know if the man drinking beside you in a cafe had betrayed neighbors to the commune, or if the woman on the stairwell had lost her husband to a Prussian bullet. Every glance held suspicion. Every wall had ears. So when a diary whispered about bodies under floorboards and voices crawling through plaster, it didn't sound like Gothic fantasy. It sounded like testimony. Because in a city where thousands had disappeared without graves, who could be sure what lay beneath your very floor? The Rue des Martyrs was not just a backdrop. It was an accomplice. Its cobblestones absorbed too many secrets. And the diary was merely one that managed to leak out. We don't know their name. That's the first and most maddening thing. Whoever wrote the Rue des Martyrs diary never signed it. Never left so much as an initial. Just a hand, a voice, and the unraveling of a mind. And yet, through the words, we catch glimpses, like shard of shattered mirror, reflecting a face we're not supposed to see. The writer describes long nights alone, listening to neighbors stomp across warped floors. They mention the bakery downstairs, the smell of yeast rising into their rented room, a note about the cracked plaster ceiling that leaks whispers when I try to sleep. This is not the voice of a nobleman or a politician. This is someone small, easily lost in the crowd, an anonymous tenant among dozens stacked in a tenement house. But anonymity doesn't mean emptiness. The entries bleed personality. Sardonic, bitter, occasionally poetic. They compare themselves to a rat chewing paper in a coffin of brick, and once, chillingly, to a priest without a god. Whoever they were, they carried both education and madness. Latin phrases scrawled in margins, sudden prayers that dissolve into obscenities. The strongest thread throughout the diary is obsession. They circle again and again around a woman, unnamed, unidentified, perhaps real, perhaps imagined. Sometimes she is alive, laughing in the stairwell, humming in the courtyard. Sometimes she is dead, beneath floorboards, beneath fingernails, beneath their skin. On one page, the writer insists, I follow her shadow to the river, but it is not hers. It walks without her. The diary paints this woman as muse, tormentor, victim, phantom. And through her, we glimpse the writer's descent. Was she a neighbor, a lover, a stranger glimpsed in a church pew? Or was she only the embodiment of his own unraveling sanity? And that's the horror, the way this faceless subject becomes a gravitational center of the text. Without her, there is only silence. With her, there is mania, blood, and ink bleeding across the page. The diary becomes less a record than a duel between the writer and this figure who may never have existed at all. Imagine that. Your entire existence reduced to a haunting in someone else's notebook, remembered not as a body, but as a shadow that never stopped whispering. That is a true subject of the Rue des Martyrs diary. Not just the anonymous hand that wrote it, but the woman who may never have been real, and yet somehow refuses to die. It begins so subtly you almost miss it. The early entries are restless but coherent. Complaints about noise, hunger, sleeplessness. A man gnawed by poverty, haunted by memory, tragic, but ordinary. And then the voice shifts, not gradually, but violently, like the diary is struck by lightning. One entry simply reads, "The knocking has begun." From that line forward, the handwriting grows jagged. Words slant downhill, letters blur, and ink pools in angry blots. The writer insists that someone or something inside the walls knows his name. He records hours listening to muffled raps behind the plaster, counting the taps like Morse code. 3 knocks, silence, then 2 more. And beneath his words lies a constant, obsessive refrain. She wants out. It isn't just knocking. A week later, the writer describes smelling rot beneath the floorboards. Not sewer rot, not spoiled food. He specifies as a sweet, sick odor of open graves. He claims the stench clings to his hands, his clothes. Even after he washes, he writes, almost cheerfully, I do not need to wash anymore. The odor is mine now. And then comes a line that turns the diary from paranoia into something darker. I buried her beneath the boards. No name, no detail. No body ever discovered in the Rue des Martyrs. Just that one bald confession, tossed into the chaos like a match into dry straw. Was it metaphor? A guilty conscience spilling over? Or was it the first honest thing the diary ever revealed? The neighbors, of course, noticed nothing. The bakery kept selling bread. The seamstress kept sewing, and the city, drunk on absinthe and exhaustion, trudged forward. Yet up in that room, the disturbance grew. The writer insists the knocking followed him outside, into cafes, even along the riverbank at night. On one page, he scrawls furiously, "It is under my feet wherever I walk. The cobblestones are hollow. Paris is hollow." What makes this all the more chilling is the timing. In 1872, thousands of communards had been executed, their bodies dumped in mass graves, many of them in Montmartre, not far from Rue des Martyrs. Was the diarist haunted by history, or by something far more personal? This is where the spiral begins. No longer a tenant scribbling frustrations. No longer a lonely man nursing obsession. From here on, the diary becomes a crime scene of ink, part confession, part hallucination, part omen. And the first disturbance was not just in his room. It was in his mind, cracking like plaster before the collapse. By the middle pages, the diary no longer reads like the rantings of one man, but like a stage play where roles are constantly swapped. Some entries are written in the first person, others in the second, and most unervingly, some in the third. He begins referring to himself as a tenant or the keeper of her silence. There's a line that still jolts me every time I read it. "He sits in this chair writing, but I am not him." That's not just madness. That's possession, or at least the convincing performance of it. The handwriting itself corroborates this descent. The careful, educated script of the first pages fractures into multiple styles. Sprawling loops, cramped scratch, even childlike scrawls. Experts who examined it decades later couldn't agree. Was it dissociative identity disorder before the term existed, or evidence of more than one hand writing in the same book? And then, the appearances of her multiply. She is no longer confined beneath the floorboards. She is at the window. She stands in the stairwell, humming. He writes that she sits on the end of his bed, combing her hair, though when he reaches to touch it, his fingers grasp only dust. Sometimes she speaks, in dialogue written into the margins. Short phrases like, "You forgot me," or "I am still hungry." Outside the diary, reality fails to align. There are no police records of neighbors reporting disturbances in the building. No evidence of missing tenants in Rue des Martyrs. No complaint of smell of blood, of any haunting presence. Everything, the knocking, the corpse, the whispers, exists only on those stained pages. But here's where it twists the knife. Occasionally, the diary records factual events in Paris. Weather, headlines, even funerals. On May 15th, he notes, "Rain swallows the boulevard, umbrellas like black wings." A surviving newspaper from the same date, indeed, describes a heavy storm flooding streets near Montmartre. How does someone veer between eerie accuracy and phantasmagoric delirium without flinching? The more you read, the more you're torn apart by contradictions. Either this was a man inventing demons in the isolation of a rented room, or someone was actively erasing evidence around him. Bodies hidden, neighbors silenced, records destroyed. A diary left behind as the only proof. And that's what keeps you staring at those pages long after you should have closed a book. The sense that something is off, grotesquely off. If it's fiction, it's too convincingly tied to fact. If it's truth, it's too perfectly orchestrated as madness. The Rue des Martyrs diary doesn't just blur the line between hallucination and reality. It obliterates it. The diary didn't enter the public record until decades later, when a bookseller near the same bought a crate of estate junk at auction. Inside, beneath brittle newspapers and a broken umbrella, was a little leather-bound volume that would unsettle scholars for generations. Once its contents leaked, everyone wanted to play detective. The first theory, straightforward madness. A veteran of the war, perhaps cracked under trauma, poverty, and isolation. Doctors of the time spoke of folie circulaire, what we now call bipolar disorder, or demonomany, a term for those who believe themselves possessed, a traumatized man, scribbling hallucinations into a diary no one was meant to read, a tragic but unremarkable explanation, but others balked. The handwriting analysis alone cast doubt. Experts identified at least 3 distinct styles within the text: fluid, jagged, and childlike. 2 different, they argued, to be explained by stress or illness alone. Could multiple authors have handled the pen? If so, who were they, and why would strangers collaborate on such a grotesque fiction in a cramped Paris flat? Then came the supernatural camp, waving their spectral banners. They pointed to the references that aligned too neatly with Montmartre's mass graves. They whisper about Saint Denis, the martyred bishop whose severed head supposedly dripped miracles just streets away. Was the root of Martyrs Diary not madness, but channeling, a seance conducted unconsciously through pen and paper? Mediums of the late 19th century certainly thought so, some claiming the diary was a rare example of automatic writing, a spirit seized in the hand of a living scribe. The police, when shown transcripts in the early 20th century, shrugged. No crime, no body, without corroborating evidence. It was just a curiosity, not a case. Yet tucked away in the Paris archives lies a single note and sign dated 1901. Do not destroy the book. It may contain evidence of what was hidden. Evidence of what? No elaboration. The literary world, of course, leapt at it. Some argued it was an experimental novel, written in fragments, years before modernism caught on. A lost genius ahead of his time. But no manuscript drafts ever appeared, no publisher's notes, no author stepping forward to claim it. And who writes a novel in their own blood, or what looks an awful lot like it? So the theories pile up like bones in a catacomb: madness, collaboration, spiritual possession, lost literature, hidden crime. None proven, none dismissed. The root of Martyr's Diary resists tidy conclusions the way a corpse resists perfume. Every answer drags with it another, uglier question. Then comes a twist that made even the most skeptical historian shiver. In 1923, a small collector in Montmartre claimed he'd found a hidden envelope tucked inside the back cover of the diary. Inside, a sketch of floor plan. A tenement building oddly familiar. Tiny excess marked beneath the boards of one room. A single name written in the margin, Clémence. The collector published his findings in a short pamphlet, but the text vanished almost immediately. Libraries listed it as lost. Copies that survived were torn, defaced, or suspiciously water-stained. Some swear the pamphlet was withdrawn because it hinted at ongoing crimes, unclaimed bodies, old graves reopened, or perhaps, as the diary insists, a presence that refused to remain buried. Meanwhile, handwriting experts who re-examined the diary discovered something horrifying. The ink on the final pages wasn't just different. It contained a chemical anomaly. Under magnification, tiny flecks of iron and organic matter were visible. Blood, according to forensic analysis decades later. Not fresh, not easily dated, but human. The diary, in effect, was partially written in blood. Whose blood? Whose hand? The author or Clémence herself, assuming she ever existed? Even stranger, neighbors from the 1870s had descendants who recalled odd stories. Whispers of a man who never left his apartment, who was often seen at night dragging something heavy beneath the floorboards. Nothing was ever officially reported, but oral histories matched the diary's timeline uncannily. A footprint here, a missing latch there, little breadcrumbs of a reality that refuses to sync with public records. And then there's the last entry. Not the one warning you to burn it. The one just before that, in sprawling, almost legible ink. I have lost her. She moves through me. I do not know where she ends and I begin. Tomorrow, I will open the floor. There is no record of the floor ever being opened. No excavation, no bodies. Just the terror, the suggestion, the possibility that the diary itself witnessed or documented its own crime. It's the moment where you realize whatever you thought was the diary's anchor, madness, fiction, historical trauma, crumbles. You're left floating in a liminal zone. And in that zone, nothing is comforting. No answer is safe. The root of Martyrs Diary has never been definitively solved, and that's precisely what makes it so haunting. Officially, there is no case, no criminal, no corpse to anchor the confessions. Parisian police files in the era list only missing persons, common, tragic, but nothing that matches the diary's grim specifics. Clémence remains untraceable. The apartment on Rue des Martyrs was demolished in the 1920s, replaced by a commercial building. Any physical evidence vanished with the rubble. Yet the diary's existence continues to provoke questions that gnaw at reason. Was a meticulous work of pathological fiction, anticipating modern horror centuries early? Or did it record real horrors, hiding in plain sight within the walls of cities still recovering from bloodshed? The multiple handwriting styles, chemical traces of blood, and uncanny alignment with historical events make a purely fictional explanation difficult to maintain. Some theorists propose a hybrid, that the author, possibly a war-traumatized veteran, began hallucinating under stress, but that real events and a real death provided the scaffolding for the madness. Others argue for something darker, a deliberate concealment, bodies hidden, witnesses silenced, history itself complicit in burying the truth. Then there are the spiritualists, whispering that Clémence was never human or never dead, that the diary captured a consciousness unwilling to be contained. The lingering questions are relentless. Who was Clémence? Was she real? And if she was, did she die under those floorboards? Or did she escape into the city's labyrinth, unnoticed, perhaps still walking through Paris centuries later? The diary offers hints, but no confirmation. It taunts the reader with partial truths, glimpses of horror that can never be fully verified. Even scholars who approach it with skepticism cannot dismiss the visceral impact. Readers report anxiety, nightmares, and a creeping sensation that the diary's whispering doesn't end on the page. The text behaves almost like a contagion. You think you're just reading, but somewhere between line 3 and line 20, it begins to inhabit your imagination, threading fear into ordinary corners of your mind. It is a resolution without closure, a haunting without a ghost, a crime without a victim confirmed. And maybe that's the point. The diary's power doesn't lie in answers. It lies in its refusal to provide them. It's a puzzle whose pieces are designed never to fit, and that very impossibility ensures it will not let go. Decades passed, and the Rue des Martyrs diary became more than a curiosity. It became a legend whispered in literary salons, libraries, and the quiet corners of Montmartre cafes. Scholars debated its authenticity. Collectors prized it, and occult enthusiasts treated it like a holy relic of terror. The diary never settled into one category. It was simultaneously a crime report, a psychological case study, and a work of proto-horror literature. Its influence rippled outward. Writers of the early 20th century cited it as inspiration for tales of haunted Parisian apartments, of unseen presences behind walls, of obsession bleeding into madness. Psychoanalysts use it to illustrate the fractures of post-war trauma, the terrifying capabilities of the human mind to create, and sometimes enact, its own horrors. Some argued it shaped public perception of Rue des Martyrs itself, turning a street of commerce and tenements into a mythic site of fear. Tourists decades later would occasionally ask guides to point out the apartment, though it no longer existed, as if the legend could resurrect brick and mortar with curiosity alone. Psychologically, the diary lingered like a shadow over anyone who studied it. Modern forensic analysts note that obsessive, fragmented writing patterns like those in the diary correlate with extreme dissociative states. But dissociation doesn't explain everything. The chemical residue, the multiple handwriting styles, the eerie alignment with historical events. Its existence challenged and continues to challenge our understanding of crime, reality, and human consciousness. And culturally, it persisted. Artists painted Montmartre interiors with hidden figures lurking in corners. Poets reference the voice on the walls as a metaphor for trauma and secrecy. Musicians in Parisian cafes perform dark ballads inspired by Clémence's elusive presence. The diary's legacy became a mirror of the city itself. Beautiful, fractured, and haunted by stories that refuse to die. Even today, the diary is studied with a mixture of reverence and fear. Every examination risks obsessive fascination, and those who handle it report a lingering unease, as though the pages carry a residual presence. The Rue de Martyrs Diary transformed from a private, terrifying account into a cultural artifact, a cautionary tale, and a reminder that some histories, especially the most sinister, cannot be neatly archived or explained. And here's the part that gnaws at you when you're alone at night, the part that refuses comfort. The Rue de Martyrs Diary doesn't just account horror, it teaches it. You realize, reading it, that terror doesn't always arrive with a scream or a corpse. Sometimes it drips slowly, like ink into veins, seeping into perception until you can no longer trust your own senses. The diary ends not with closure, but with an open mouth of darkness. Clémence is gone, or she was never there. The author is gone, or perhaps still wandering Paris in some unrecorded alley, whispering to walls that remember more than they should. The pages themselves survive, yet they are no longer inert. They vibrate in the imagination of each reader, carrying a contagion of doubt. What is real and what is manufactured? What is human and what is something else? Something older, something patient. It's easy to romanticize madness in literature, to treat it as a spectacle, but the diary leaves no room for irony or detachment. You feel the claustrophobia of that apartment, the stench of rot and ink, the persistent knock behind the walls. You sense the obsessive gaze of the writer, the spectral weight of Clémence, and the thought creeps in, subtle at first, then insistent. What if the diary is still learning? Paris keeps its secrets well. Streets absorb them. Stones remember when humans forget. But the diary proves one thing. Some things are too slippery, too stubborn to ever be buried. History is not a ledger of facts. It is a haunted room, and the Rue de Martyrs Diary is its key, or its lock, depending on how daring or foolish you are enough to turn the pages. If you ever find yourself in Montmartre, walk slowly. Listen. The city hums with lives long ended, with footsteps that shouldn't exist, with whispers that will not die. Somewhere in those murmurs, perhaps you will hear her, Clémence, and perhaps, if you are unlucky or curious, you will feel the walls themselves beginning to whisper your name. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.